She didn't just sing songs. She transformed silence into emotion. Her voice wasn't loud or dramatic, it was soft, pure, and impossibly human. In an era when soul music often shouted for attention, Roberta Flack whispered, and the world still listened. Picture the glow of a late-night studio in Washington, D.C., the sound of a piano echoing through empty halls, and a young woman shaping her pain into beauty. That quiet strength, that unshakable grace, would soon change the language of soul forever. How does someone so timeless, so quietly revolutionary, fade from the spotlight? Let's get into Roberta Flack's story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before there were gold records, Grammys, or standing ovations, there was a little girl sitting at an old upright piano in a modest home in Black Mountain, North Carolina. Her name was Roberta Flack, and even as a child, she carried music the way others carried breath. Her mother played the organ at the local church, her father the harmonica, and in that humble mix of gospel and homegrown harmony, Roberta found her first sense of belonging. When her family moved to Arlington, Virginia, she was just 5 years old, a shy, observant child who preferred the piano keys to playground chatter. The church became her first stage. Every Sunday, sunlight fell through stained glass as her fingers danced across the keys, and even then, there was something different about her, touch, delicate but certain, tender but fearless. Her mother would later say that Roberta didn't simply play notes, she told stories through them. Those early hymns, filled with longing and hope, became the foundation for a sound that would later defy categories somewhere between gospel, jazz, classical, and pure soul. At 13, she entered a statewide competition for young black pianists and placed second, a moment that quietly marked the beginning of something extraordinary. 2 years later, she won a full scholarship to Howard University, one of the most prestigious historically black universities in America. It was an honor few girls her age or background could dream of. At Howard, Roberta immersed herself in the classical world. She studied Chopin and Bach, not Aretha or Ray Charles. Her professors saw in her a rare gift, precision married to emotion. Yet even within the rigid walls of classical tradition, she longed for something freer, something that sounded like her mother's church and her father's laughter. She was, in every sense, a soul in search of her own language. Outside the practice rooms, America was changing. The 1,950 carried both promise and prejudice. The civil rights movement was stirring, and in the heart of Washington, D.C., young black artists like Roberta were quietly rewriting what it meant to be seen and heard. For her, music wasn't rebellion, it was refuge. After earning her degree in music education, she planned to pursue a doctorate, but life had other plans. Her father passed away suddenly, and with the weight of grief and responsibility pressing on her, Roberta turned her focus to survival. She began teaching music first in North Carolina, then back in D.C., pouring the same patience and grace she once gave her piano into her students. But when night fell, she returned to the piano not as a teacher, but as herself. She began performing at small D.C. clubs, intimate spaces where the crowd was close enough to feel the music breathe. Her sets were quiet, soulful, and unhurried, unlike anything the local audiences were used to. She played for tips, for connection, and sometimes simply for the peace it brought her. It was during one of those late nights that her artistry began to take shape. Listeners would lean in, drawn to her voice that felt more like a confession than a performance. It wasn't just the notes, it was the truth between them. Roberta Flack didn't set out to chase fame. She was simply searching for a sound that felt honest, one that could hold both the discipline of classical music and the raw ache of gospel. In the process, she created something that didn't fit in any box and that, unknowingly, made her timeless. Before the red carpets and flashing lights, there was just a dream and a piano. And for Roberta Flack, that was enough to begin. By the mid-1960s, Roberta Flack was living two lives. By day, she was a devoted music teacher, guiding young students through the fundamentals of melody and rhythm. By night, she was something entirely different, a quiet storm behind a piano in smoky Washington, D.C. clubs, where every note she played seemed to linger in the air long after it faded. Her reputation began to spread through whispers. She wasn't flashy, and she didn't try to outsing anyone. Instead, she made silence her ally. Between every phrase, there was space, space that let the audience feel, remember, and breathe. In a world that celebrated volume, her calm became revolutionary. At the 1,500 Club, and later at the Mr. Henry's Lounge, she played marathon sets 3 each night, 5 nights a week. The crowds were a mix of professionals, college students, and music lovers looking for refuge from the chaos of the capital. Among them were names that would later define American pop culture: Burt Bacharach, Dionne Warwick, and Johnny Mathis. They all came to hear the woman who could make a single chord sound like a conversation with God. The intimacy of those performances caught the attention of jazz pianist and producer Leigh McCann. He'd heard rumors about a soft-voiced pianist in D.C. who could blend Bach with the blues. One evening, he stopped by to see for himself. By the end of the first set, he was stunned. McCann later said that her voice was like velvet and truth at the same time. He didn't waste time. McCann arranged for her to audition for Joel Dorn, a producer at Atlantic Records, the label that had already shaped the sounds of Ray Charles and Aretha Franklin. When Dorn heard her, he knew he was witnessing something rare, a voice that didn't just perform but transformed. He signed her on the spot. In June 1969, Roberta Flack released her debut album, First Take. It was a quiet record in a loud era, filled with delicate piano arrangements and introspective songs that defied the conventions of R&B and soul. The standout track, Compared to What?, a protest song written by Gene McDaniels, hinted at her subtle social consciousness, but the album went largely unnoticed. The world, it seemed, wasn't ready for her kind of honesty. Still, she didn't lose faith. She returned to the studio, collaborating with musicians like King Curtis and Donny Hathaway, a fellow Howard University alumnus, whose musical chemistry with her was immediate and electric. They shared not just melodies, but a mutual respect, a sense that their voices spoke the same emotional language. Her second album, Chapter 2, arrived in 1970, richer and more confident. Though it didn't break sales records, it carried a quiet assurance that greatness was coming. Songs like Reverend Lee and her reimagining of Jimmy Webb's Do What You Gotta Do showed her ability to blend spirituality with sensuality, restraint with rebellion. By the end of that decade, Roberta had become a musician's musician, admired by peers, respected by critics, but still a stranger to mainstream fame. What she didn't know was that her next chapter would arrive not through marketing or ambition, but through a moment of fate. A film director named Clint Eastwood would soon hear one of her older songs, a slow, haunting ballad buried in her debut album, and decide to use it in his new movie. That decision would change everything. Clint Eastwood, then an actor venturing into directing, was finishing his psychological thriller Play Misty for Me. While driving one night, he heard Roberta's version of The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face on the radio. The song had been recorded 2 years earlier for her debut album First Take, but had never found an audience. To Eastwood, it wasn't just a song, it was a heartbeat. He decided to use it in the most intimate scene of the film. When the movie premiered, audiences were stunned. The pairing of her tender, breathy voice with Eastwood's haunting visuals created something transcendent. It wasn't just a soundtrack moment, it was cinematic poetry. Suddenly, radio stations across America began playing the song non-stop. By early 1972, The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 6 weeks. It also topped the R&B and adult contemporary charts, turning Roberta Flack into an overnight sensation after years of quiet perseverance. The song won Grammy Record of the Year, and her name, once whispered in D.C. lounges, was now on every marquee from New York to Los Angeles. But success didn't change her. Roberta carried herself with the same calm dignity she always had. Reporters described her as gentle but commanding, a woman whose voice could fill a room without ever rising above a whisper. While the industry rushed to label her jazz, soul, R&B, she refused to fit into any single box. "I sing truth," she once said. "Call it whatever you want." Following her breakthrough, Roberta reunited with Donny Hathaway to record Where Is the Love, a duet that captured the perfect balance between warmth and sorrow. Their chemistry was undeniable, two voices woven together like memory and echo. The song reached #5 on the pop charts, won another Grammy, and cemented their place as one of music's most soulful duos. From there, the hits followed effortlessly. Yet beneath the success was a sense of stillness, a kind of restraint that defined Roberta's artistry. Her music never demanded attention, it earned it. Even as she stood among the most powerful voices of her time, Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, Gladys Knight, Roberta Flack carved her own lane, introspective, refined, deeply human. Her follow-up albums, Quiet Fire and Killing Me Softly, would push her artistry even further. But in these early moments between the club stages and the spotlight, she revealed something rare in the world of fame: patience. She had waited years for the world to listen, and when it finally did, she didn't shout her triumph. She simply played another chord, whispered another truth, and let the music speak for her. For Roberta Flack, the turning point wasn't about fame, it was about finally being heard. By 1973, Roberta Flack was standing at the top of the world. Her music, once too soft for radio, had now become the voice of a generation learning how to feel again. She wasn't just singing songs. She was redefining what soul could sound like when stripped of its excess and laid bare in truth. When Killing Me Softly with his song was released, it didn't just climb the charts, it conquered them. The melody moved like a sigh, and Roberta's voice carried both ache and grace. It was a love letter, a confession, a prayer all at once. For 4 straight weeks, the song ruled the Billboard Hot 100, and in 1974, it won her another Grammy for Record of the Year, making her the first artist in history to win the award in consecutive years. But for Roberta, success was never about the trophies. She once said, "Awards don't make you a better artist, silence does." And that silence was her signature. While other artists filled the air with sound, she filled it with space, with breath, pauses, and the courage to let emotion linger. That subtle artistry became her revolution. Her 1,973 album, Killing Me Softly, was a triumph not only commercially but spiritually. Songs like Jessie and No Tears, in the end, revealed her gift for intimacy, the ability to turn pain into poetry. Critics began to call her the Quiet Storm, a term that would later define an entire genre of soulful, slow-tempo R&B in the decades to come. Beyond the charts, her influence spread through the music community. Young singers and musicians, especially black women, saw in Roberta a model of elegance and self-determination. She didn't chase trends, she created timelessness. She could move effortlessly between genres, blurring the lines between jazz, folk, and pop, while still holding the emotional weight of gospel. And yet, despite the applause, Roberta remained grounded. She often returned to Washington, D.C., to perform benefit concerts for schools and children's organizations. The same piano teacher who once struggled to make rent was now using her success to lift others. There was humility in her presence, an understanding that fame was fleeting, but purpose was not. Still, behind that serenity was exhaustion. The demands of touring, recording, and public attention began to wear her down. But even as the industry expected more albums, more hits, more exposure, Roberta held her pace. She preferred to let her songs breathe rather than force them into being. When she walked into a studio, there were no fireworks, no chaos, just focus. She'd dim the lights, close her eyes, and let the music find her. Musicians who worked with her said it felt less like a session and more like a ceremony, a quiet communion between sound and soul. In those years, she stood alongside Aretha Franklin and Stevie Wonder as one of Atlantic Records' most revered artists. But while their sounds demanded the spotlight, Roberta's invited reflection. She didn't need the noise to be heard. She needed only truth, and that truth carried her through the decade's most defining year. Her success wasn't an explosion, it was a slow, radiant burn, the kind that doesn't fade when the crowd goes home. Every rise in Hollywood carries a shadow, and for Roberta Flack, that shadow began to grow quietly. By the late 1970s, she was no longer the shy pianist from D.C. She was an international star. But success had a price, and fame began to weigh heavier than applause. The world loved her voice, but few understood the loneliness that often came with being perfect. Her creative bond with Donny Hathaway had been one of the purest collaborations in music. Together, they recorded Where Is the Love, and later, The Closer I Get to You, songs that captured love not as fantasy, but as something fragile and deeply human. Their voices blended like twin reflections, each softening the other's pain. But behind that harmony was Donnie's private struggle with mental illness. Roberta, ever compassionate, stood by him through the darkness. They were more than duet partners. They were kindred souls bound by empathy and music. When Donnie died tragically in 1979, falling from the balcony of his New York apartment, Roberta was shattered. She later said, "I couldn't sing for a long time. I felt like part of my voice went with him." Her album, Roberta Flack, featuring Donny Hathaway, which she finished alone, became both a tribute and a farewell. Songs like Back Together Again and You Are My Heaven, co-written by Stevie Wonder, offered glimpses of joy, but beneath them lay quiet grief. The music world celebrated her professionalism, but few saw the emptiness behind her calm. In the years that followed, she pushed herself to keep working. Atlantic Records urged her to stay visible, to keep releasing albums and touring, but the industry was changing. Disco was fading, pop was shifting, and new genres like funk and hip-hop were reshaping the American sound. The very world Roberta had once transformed was now evolving without her. Her performances remained exquisite, but critics began calling her too refined, too polished. They wanted volume, she offered subtlety, and in a business that feeds on novelty, subtlety doesn't always survive. Still, she continued to sing with grace. When asked about the pressure to reinvent herself, Roberta replied, "I don't chase trends. I chase truth. The world can catch up when it's ready." But truth has its own silence. The long studio nights grew lonelier. The tours became shorter. Even as she smiled on stage, there were days she couldn't find the strength to rehearse. And though she never spoke publicly about depression, those who knew her saw the fatigue, the quiet kind that fame doesn't cure. Yet, through it all, Roberta never lost her dignity. Even in pain, she carried herself like a woman aware that every note she sang was part of something sacred. Her music became slower, more introspective, a mirror reflecting not just love, but loss, aging, and endurance. By the dawn of the 1980, Roberta Flack stood at a crossroads, adored by millions, haunted by memory, and unsure of where her sound fit in a new, restless world. What she didn't realize was that the next chapter of her journey would be one of survival, a quiet battle, not for fame, but for peace. The 1980 began not with applause, but with uncertainty. For Roberta Flack, the soft lights of the 1970 had faded into a colder, faster decade. The radio stations that once played her voice endlessly were now filled with drum machines, synth beats, and the new flash of MTV. Soul had given way to spectacle, and there was little room left for quiet grace. After the death of Donny Hathaway, Roberta tried to rebuild. She poured her pain into the studio, creating music that tried to balance nostalgia with renewal. Her 1980 album, Roberta Flack featuring Donny Hathaway, brought her two R&B hits Back Together Again and You Are My Heaven, but behind those harmonies was a woman still trying to heal. The pressure from Atlantic Records didn't stop. The label wanted another hit, another anthem that could reach a younger audience. Roberta complied, but her heart was never in the chase. In 1982, she recorded Making Love for a Hollywood film of the same name, a shimmering ballad that returned her briefly to the pop charts. The song was a success, but it wasn't salvation. Success, after all, is not the same as peace. To the public, she was still the elegant songbird of the 1970, but off stage, the rhythm of her life had slowed. The isolation of fame began to take its toll. She spoke less, trusted fewer people, and spent most of her time between her Manhattan apartment and the studio. Those who knew her described her as disciplined to the edge of loneliness. In 1983, she recorded Born to Love with Peabo Bryson, a duet album that reignited some of her spark. Their hit, Tonight I Celebrate My Love, climbed the charts and became a wedding standard across America. But even in that romantic glow, Roberta's performances carried something bittersweet. It was as if every note was a goodbye to the world she once knew. She kept recording albums like I'm the One, Oasis, and Set the Night to Music, but each one felt more like a chapter of reflection than reinvention. The 1990 arrived, and with them came the rise of hip-hop and neo-soul. The very essence of what Roberta once pioneered, the fusion of softness and truth, was now being reborn through younger voices. Yet few remembered who had opened that door first. And still, she didn't complain. Roberta believed every artist had their season, and hers had simply passed. When asked how she felt about being called underrated, she smiled gently and said, "I don't need to be loud to be remembered." The crisis wasn't in her career, it was in the silence, in learning to live with the stillness after decades of applause, in realizing that sometimes the most difficult song to perform is the one life writes for you. As the spotlight dimmed, Roberta Flack found herself in a quieter world, one that mirrored the softness of her own music. The endless tours slowed, the phone calls grew fewer, and the audience that once filled grand theaters was replaced by intimate crowds who came not for novelty, but for reverence. She had entered a new season of her life, one where applause no longer defined her worth. The industry had shifted faster beats, younger faces, louder sounds, but Roberta refused to chase what didn't feel true. Instead, she chose depth over relevance, comfort over competition. In the late 1980 and early 1990, she continued to record, though at her own pace. Oasis brought her back to the R&B charts, proving that even in a changing landscape, there was still room for sincerity. The song's gentle groove and introspective lyrics reminded listeners that soul didn't need to shout, it only needed to speak honestly. Her collaborations reflected that same quiet strength. With Maxi Priest, she recorded "Set the Night to Music" in 1991, a graceful duet that reached the top 10 on the pop charts. The success was sweet, but fleeting. Roberta seemed content with that. She once said, "Music isn't a race, it's a memory you leave behind." By the mid-1990, she was performing less frequently, choosing carefully when and where to appear. Audiences who attended those later concerts described them as sacred. There was no spectacle, just Roberta, her piano, and that unmistakable voice, slightly aged, but richer in truth. When she sang "Killing Me Softly" decades after its release, it no longer sounded like heartbreak, it sounded like forgiveness. The years took their toll, as they do with every artist. Her health began to waver. She suffered a stroke that made performing difficult. Still, she returned whenever she could, not for fame, but for love, the love of sharing something real. She once told an interviewer, "If I can't sing with power, I'll sing with memory." In 2018, she collapsed during a performance at the Apollo Theater, one of the very stages that had celebrated her decades earlier. Doctors later revealed she had been battling the lingering effects of her stroke. She recovered quietly, away from the cameras, cared for by family and close friends. Then, in 2022, the news broke. Roberta Flack had been diagnosed with ALS, a disease that would gradually take away her ability to sing. It was a cruel irony for someone whose entire life had been shaped by sound. Yet in her final public statement, she showed no bitterness. She simply said, "I have sung all my life. The songs will keep singing through you." That was her farewell, not an ending, but a passing of light. Even as her voice fell silent, her spirit echoed through every generation that followed. When the cameras stopped rolling, the silence in her life became deafening but not empty. It was filled with the music she had already given to the world. When the applause faded and the years began to stretch behind her, Roberta Flack had already done something very few artists ever achieve. She changed how the world defined soul. Her voice wasn't a weapon, it was a whisper. It didn't command attention through force, but through truth. And in doing so, she taught generations that power can live in silence. In America, her influence ran deeper than the charts. She gave voice to tenderness at a time when black artistry was expected to be loud, political, or explosive. Her music was all of those things, but quietly so. Songs like "The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face" and "Killing Me Softly" with his song became timeless standards, reinterpreted across genres, cultures, and decades. The 1996 remake of "Killing Me Softly" by the Fugees reignited her legacy, introducing her music to an entirely new generation. That version topped charts worldwide, but it also carried her name back into the conversation, a reminder that the sound they were celebrating was born from Roberta's original grace. Lauryn Hill herself called her the mother of modern soul. Yet, beyond the hits and accolades, Roberta's real legacy lived in her quiet defiance. She was a classically trained pianist in an era that rarely made room for black women in classical music. She proved that sophistication and soul were not opposites, they were partners. In her performances, the line between Bach and Billie Holiday blurred into something beautifully her own. In the 1970s, her success opened doors for a generation of female artists who didn't want to be molded by record executives. Singers like Anita Baker, Sade, and later Alicia Keys would follow in her footsteps, each carrying a piece of her restraint, her emotional honesty, her devotion to craft over fame. But her impact didn't stop at music. Roberta Flack was also a philanthropist and educator. She established music programs for children in public schools, often funding instruments and lessons out of her own pocket. She believed that art could heal what society ignored. To her, teaching was never a backup plan, it was part of her calling. Across the Atlantic, European critics hailed her as the high priestess of quiet soul. In Japan, where subtlety and emotion are deeply valued, her albums sold consistently for decades. Her 2012 project, Let It Be Roberta, a tribute to the Beatles, became a modest hit there, showing how her artistry transcended borders and time. And in the broader landscape of American culture, her name carried a certain purity, an emblem of artistry, untouched by scandal or ego. She wasn't a diva. She was a craftsman, a poet, and a vessel for truth. Even those who didn't know her name recognized her sound, the soft piano chords, the breath between phrases, the way emotion seemed to arrive half a second before the note. When she received the Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted long after she left the stage. For many, it wasn't just about honoring her success, it was about thanking her for teaching the world how to feel. Roberta Flack's legacy wasn't carved in noise or headlines. It was written in stillness, the kind that lingers when a song ends, and you realize you've been holding your breath. When the news broke in February 2025 that Roberta Flack had passed away at the age of 88, the world fell silent, not the kind of silence that follows shock, but the kind that comes with reverence. For those who had grown up with her music, it felt like saying goodbye to a part of their own history. For younger generations, it was the realization that the voice behind so many timeless melodies was gone, yet somehow still everywhere. The tributes came swiftly. Artists across genres from Alicia Keys to John Legend, from Norah Jones to H.E.R., spoke about how Roberta's music had shaped their understanding of emotion. Lauryn Hill called her the bridge between vulnerability and strength. Stevie Wonder said simply, "When Roberta sang, you felt seen." In Washington, D.C., where her journey began, the Howard University Choir performed "The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face" in her honor. The audience wept not out of sadness, but gratitude. They were remembering a woman who had turned gentleness into power, and who had proven that soul could be both soft and unbreakable. Across social media, fans shared memories of hearing her songs for the first time, driving with their parents, dancing at weddings, falling in love, or surviving heartbreak. Her music had been there for life's quietest moments. One fan wrote, "Roberta Flack didn't just sing what we felt, she made us feel safe for feeling it." In the days that followed, television networks aired retrospectives, rediscovering performances long forgotten, her poised smile at the Grammys, her laughter with Donny Hathaway, her gentle hand resting on the piano as if it were a living thing. It reminded the world that greatness doesn't always announce itself, it whispers. Her passing also reignited conversations about how easily true artistry can be overlooked in an industry obsessed with immediacy. Critics reflected on how Roberta's career had defied every expectation for a black female artist of her generation. She didn't shout, she didn't sensationalize, she endured. Her success wasn't a wave, it was a current that shaped everything quietly around it. Internationally, tributes poured in from London, Paris, Tokyo, and Johannesburg. In Japan, radio stations dedicated an entire week to her catalog, calling her the eternal calm in a noisy century. In France, magazines revisited her influence on chanson and jazz vocalists. And in the United States, her songs re-entered the Billboard charts, once more proof that legacy never dies, it simply waits to be remembered. At her memorial service in Harlem, a grand piano stood under a single spotlight. There were no elaborate speeches, just music. A young singer performed "Killing Me Softly," her voice trembling at first, then steadying as the crowd joined in softly. By the time she reached the final line, the entire room was singing together. It was as if Roberta's spirit had returned for one last encore. As the years go by, her absence still feels like a quiet pause in the melody of American music, a rest note between generations. But the echo of her voice endures, gently reminding the world that greatness isn't always loud, and love doesn't always arrive with noise. Roberta Flack once said, "I don't sing for recognition. I sing so people won't feel alone." And even now, she hasn't stopped doing that. The stage is dark again. The piano rests silent, its last note still trembling in memory. Somewhere in that silence lives Roberta Flack, the girl who once played hymns in a small Carolina church, the woman who taught the world how to feel without shouting, the legend who turned tenderness into timelessness. Her story isn't about fame. It's about endurance, the quiet kind that doesn't fade when the lights go out. In an industry that often celebrated noise, Roberta gave us stillness. She proved that you could move hearts not by breaking them, but by holding them gently. When you listen to "The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face Today," it doesn't sound old. It sounds eternal. The same is true for "Killing Me Softly," "The Closer I Get to You," and every song she touched. They live beyond their era because they came from something real. Her art wasn't built for charts, it was built for souls. In the end, Roberta Flack's legacy is not just music, it's memory. It's the reminder that greatness doesn't always wear a spotlight. Sometimes, it sits quietly at a piano, closing its eyes, and trusting that someone out there is listening. And we still are. If you ever loved her voice, her courage, or her grace, take a moment to remember what she gave us, the beauty of restraint, the strength of gentleness, and the timeless truth that love doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Do you think Hollywood ever gave Roberta Flack the respect she truly deserved? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep her memory alive. Because on Stars Underrated, we don't just remember the legends, we give them their flowers while the music still echoes. Let me know where you're watching this from and whose story you want us to tell next. Until next time, keep their light alive.